What's happening? Adam Drake here, and today I'm going to show you a little tip or trick to make a carburetor a little bit smoother. So from the manufacturer, the carburetor should come really smooth, everything should function and work perfect. But if you have a really hard impact, or if the carburetor ever has the slide slightly open and you case a jump, the carburetor can become really sticky. And a lot of times guys think the carburetor's junk. In some cases it is, but in most cases you're able to fix the carburetor. Now you can send the carburetor in, I can do this little tip trick and make it smooth again for you, but I wanted to do a video to show you if you want to do it yourself. So I'm going to go ahead, show you the tools needed, and then also how to do it to make the carburetor nice and smooth again. This is a Flashpoint FPO2 carburetor. It's a OS21J, and I believe what happened was, again, hard landing when the slide was partially open, and that's made the carburetor really stiff and sticky to where the engine would stick with the throttle on, so you'd essentially have a runaway. So as far as the tools needed, I just have a MIP driver to remove the ball on the end of the carburetor. So if you have the stock set screw, it's just a 1.5. In this case, the person has a 2 mil. You're going to need a flathead tuning screwdriver. And from there, you will go ahead and remove the idle screw completely. And then you will also remove the carburetor boot from the engine. I like to just go ahead, take the venturi and everything else off also. That way we're going to put some oil in there and I'll show you a little bit more, but that way it just keeps everything a little bit cleaner. And then from there I'm going to go ahead, adjust the camera angle and show you just kind of a closer view of it. You'll also need some oil. So I have here, it's just our Drake Afterrun oil, the Marvel's Mystery Oil WD-40 mix. And then also some Tri-Flow. This is what I use in my NMB bearings in all my Mugen cars. And then you'll need a drill with a large enough chuck to be able to grip the end of the slide where this ball assembly for the linkage goes. So let me go ahead and adjust the camera and we'll show you a closer look. Okay, so like I mentioned, I went ahead and removed the ball that the linkage connects to, the carb boot, and also the venturi. So you can see here, this is really, really difficult to move the slide in and out. And what normally happens is if the carb angle is too close to the center diff mount, in a hard impact, the center diff mount will hit the slide here and it will cause a little bit of damage where the idle screw rides. Now the slide is hard anodized, so it's pretty hard, but again it can cause some damage. And then the inside of the carburetor body is not hard anodized. Both parts don't need to be hard anodized, because as long as you have one that's smooth and hard anodized, everything usually is really smooth and free. But what happens is there ends up being a little burr either on the slide here or inside the body of the carburetor. So what I do is I will just take a drill, and you're wanting to make sure you clamp on the very end of the carburetor where this ball would normally fit. You don't want to grip past that because you don't want to damage any part of the slide. So you don't have to clamp super tight. Then what I'll do is take a fair bit of this Tri-Flow oil and then I'll run the drill in both directions fairly slow, and then eventually I'll speed it up, and then you'll want to move the carburetor in and out just so that you're basically kind of resurfacing or almost like honing the body of the carburetor with the slide. And again, the slide's hard anodized. Everything was machined properly when it was manufactured. And then there's some little oil grooves in the slide. So those almost work as though it's like a reamer for the barrel of the carburetor. So. Go ahead and remove that. Sometimes you have to do it a couple times, but you'll see that from all the oil and then with the inner body of the carburetor not being hard anodized, there'll be just a little bit of the aluminum coming off, and that's just where it kind of knocked down the burrs. So I'll go ahead and clean this really good, do the same thing. Take a brand new microfiber towel, just kind of clean any of the excess oil from inside the carb body. And again, sometimes you got to do this a couple times, but you'll just go ahead and put the slide in. Be careful to make sure that the slide is lined up properly when you go to put the idle screw in. On the OS carbs, there's like a flat spot on top, and that should be perfectly on top or in line with the venturi. Slowly put the idle screw back in. I always like to, before I run it all the way in, make sure that it's actually lined up with that groove where it's supposed to. And then I'll run the idle screw in to where it's about flush. And that'll just be my starting point just to check the carb. And now you can see the carb is super smooth and free. From there, I will set the idle gap on the carburetor, and you will need to make some small adjustments once you fire the engine for the first time. But what I like to use is just a small zip tie. So the tip of this zip tie measures 0.55 millimeters, so just over a half a millimeter. And the baseline for any OS carburetor for the idle gap is a half a millimeter. So what I'll do is I'll start with the idle screw again, right at about flush, which is usually a little bit over a half a millimeter. So I'll slide this down in there. And what you're wanting to do is for when the barrel is fully closed, it to just barely pinch the zip tie. Now I can hold the carburetor and I can just slowly back out the idle screw and just make sure there's just a little bit of tension, because again, this is 0.55 millimeters. So if this is loose, the idle gap is 0.55 or larger. I want it to just barely have a little bit of tension and clamp the end of that. Then you can just go ahead, put the carb boot back on. Always make sure to check the carb boot first. Make sure that there's no rips or tears in the carb boot, because you'll have an air leak and inconsistent tuning. You can put the ball back on carburetor, and that doesn't need to be super tight. I usually use a little bit of thread lock just to make sure, because this isn't something that you check very often, and you want to make sure that that never comes off, or you can potentially have a runaway. Then I'll take that same zip tie and I will use that to secure and help seal the boot at the base. You don't have to do that. It's just kind of a little security precaution that I use, but you can see that the carb is super, super smooth. It's just like how it would be when it's new, without having to completely replace the carburetor, and put this back on the engine, make some fine tuning adjustments to the carburetor, and you should be ready to hit the track again.